So this lecture forms part 2 of the chapter 1 from Deaton, and we are starting with the section on global poverty and global inequality in this lecture. So far we've talked about health and well-being. We've talked about how is the relationship between, what is the exact relationship between health parameters and income level. In this section we are going to talk about the inequality of income and what is the relationship of income with poverty and with inequality in the global scenario, in the world scenario. So, material living standards are improving in most countries of the world, but there is no guarantee that growth will automatically lead to reduction in poverty. It is possible that even a country which is growing, it is only impacting the well-off population of the country. So it's possible that the growth, if there is a significant amount of inequality in the growth for a particular nation, then it is possible that only the well-off sections of that economy are growing and the poor are left apart. So there is no automatic link between growth and reduction in poverty. The other possibility is that the poorest countries in the world are not growing at all. So even if we feel that the world is growing, it is possible that the growth is again unequal across countries and the poorest countries are not growing at all. So there could be inequality in the world across countries, or there could be inequality within the country across different segments of population. So there is no automatic link between growth, economic growth and inequality. Is it that the poorer countries are not growing at all, or is it that everyone everyone is not benefited in a particular country and it is only the richer sections or the well-off sections who are benefited with economic growth? One way to look at this is to believe that if economies had to come at par with each other, then initially poor countries should have grown faster than initially rich countries, which means that the distance, so initially poor countries should have grown faster than initially rich countries if the growth inequality had to become lesser, because poorer countries will have to come at par with the richer countries and hence initially they will have to grow at a faster rate. This should happen if the gaps between them are too narrow, which means that if the inequality had to decrease, then this should have happened. Also, if the progress in science and practical knowledge, which is considered to be available, and now that with globalization process, the transfer of this science and practical knowledge is also possible to be transferred from one country to another country, then we should have believed that poorer countries should have grown at a faster rate as compared to richer countries. This is a hypothesis that we are making to understand if the inequalities, if the growth inequalities in the world has decreased or not. So in this figure, in the next figure, we try and look at this pattern and we try and inspect if there is any such pattern between the income of the nation and the growth rate of that nation. So we start this analysis by a hypothesis that poorer countries should grow faster than the richer countries. So here you will see two kinds of dots. One is a lighter dot and the other one is a darker dot. On the y-axis you have the average rate of growth for two time periods. One is 1960 to 2010 and the other one is 1970 to 2010. So the darker circles here represent the average growth rate of the period 1960 to 2010, whereas the lighter circles represent average growth rate from 1970 to 2010. And on the x-axis you have the absolute level of GDP per capita in 1960 or 70, depending on which point you're talking about. So basically for each country we have one dark point and one light point. The dark point represents the relationship between GDP per capita in 1960 to the average growth rate of GDP per capita between 1960 and 2010, and the lighter circle represents the relationship between GDP per capita of 1970 with the average rate of growth of GDP per capita between 1970 and 2010. And if you look at this scatter diagram, we hypothetically we would have imagined that there should have been some relationship which will look something like a negative relationship, because we believe that the poorer countries which have lesser GDP per capita would have grown at a faster rate as compared to the richer countries. But we don't see any such pattern here. This scatter diagram is a random, it shows us a random set of dots, and there is no clear relationship that we could establish here. So our hypothesis doesn't seem to be holding true, at least in this figure. But we can notice that almost all the points, majority of the points are above this dotted line. This dotted line here represents the average growth rate equal to 0, and most of the countries are lying above these, most of these points are lying above this dotted line, which indicates that even in the absence of any such trend, one fact that we can make from this diagram from this figure is that nearly all countries had positive growth rate, because all of them are lying above the broken line, which indicates 0 growth rate. But we don't really see any pattern which indicates that poor countries had grown faster than richer countries or vice versa. We even don't see any results which could show that richer countries are growing faster than the poorer countries. So we don't really see any clear pattern here from this figure. A mere rearrangement of this figure gives us this another figure, which is figure 5. Now in this figure, what we are doing here is that we are inflating the dots, the smaller dots here, proportional to the population in the initial year. So now instead of just making small points, we are taking the points to be proportional to the population of these countries in their respective time periods. So now if you look at this figure, it is the same figure with the same data point. The only difference is that we are now inflating the points proportional to the population of these countries. Now if you look at this figure, we do get some kind of trend which looks like a negative trend. So what is it that sort of differentiates this graph from that graph is, and why do we see a trend here, whereas in that case, in the previous case, we did not see any such trend? It is just a different visualization of the graph, and the reason why we see such a trend is because of these bigger dots here that we see, which represent, so these two dots which are the most populous countries are the Chinese, this represents the Chinese population, and this represents the Indian population for 1970s and 1960s. And you see that for both years, you see that they are growing at a much faster rate as compared to the other economies who share the same level of GDP. So even if we had to make a claim that that poorer countries are growing faster than the richer countries, it can only be made based on these two countries which are absorbing a majority of the world population in this time period. So with the adjustment of the population, we do see some trend which goes in coherence with our hypothesis that poorer countries grow faster than the richer countries to catch up with the growth rate of the richer countries. So the two largest countries in the world, China and India, have grown very rapidly over the past half century, and because there are so many people in both, their growth has brought the average incomes of more than 2 billion people from the bottom of the world income distribution to somewhere much closer to the middle. So because these two countries have been growing at a much faster rate in the past few decades, and since they absorb a majority of the world population, so the growth in these two countries solely are responsible for the kind of trend that we are seeing in this figure. Of course, having said that, it is not at all true that everyone shares the same income in each country. Obviously, there will be some intra-country inequalities, within the country inequalities that we will discuss. And in fact, income inequality is widening in all the countries. In almost all, in a lot of countries, income inequality are widening. Once within country income inequality is taken into account, what is happening to income inequality over the citizens of the world is much less clear, though a good case can be made that it is decreasing. So we will be sure of the inequalities, or a clearer trend of inequalities would come into picture when we adjust for these within country inequalities as well. Right now, from this figure, we can only make an indication that if we make a comparison across countries, then yes, we do see a negative trend, but this negative trend is largely because of these two populous countries, China and India. The rapid growth of China and India has not only enabled hundreds of millions of the world's citizens to make the great escape, but made the world a more equal place. If we care about people rather than countries, the optimistic picture in figure 5 and not the pessimistic picture in figure 4 is the correct one. So what we are trying to say here is, in this paragraph, it is a very important and a very it is an important paragraph to understand, because it is trying to build on some very fundamental ideas, which is that because of the rapid growth of these two countries, a lot of people have been enabled to escape, to make that great escape that we started the chapter with. The great escape that Deaton has been talking about. We talk about that again, and we say that because of the rapid growth in these two countries, a lot of people have been able to move out, to escape, to make that great leap and great escape. But this figure 5 can be relied only if we believe in the upliftment of people and not countries, because these two countries are the only countries, these are the two exceptional countries in the set of these countries which are growing at a much faster rate. All other countries are below the growth rate of these two countries, you will just notice here. So if we believe that people have to develop, then this optimistic picture is a much is the correct approach to take ahead, rather than figure 4 that we just saw, which showed no clear trends. But if we believe that countries have to grow and there has to be more equality in the sense of countries, then this picture gives us a more accurate view, because we do see that if we talk about countries, then definitely not all countries are growing at a faster rate. It is only these two countries which are growing at a faster rate, which are absorbing a lot of population. So if we rely on people, then if we care about people, then the optimistic picture in this figure is a correct view to take ahead. So the story of global poverty is also much affected by what has been happening in China and India. The World Bank regularly calculates the number of people in the world who live in households with daily income less than $1 a person. So this is the benchmark poverty line that has been identified by the World Bank, and the World Bank tries to calculate the number of people who fall below the poverty line, and the latest version of these numbers up to 2008 was calculated by the World Bank, which are presented in figure 6, and you will notice a very interesting trend here. So you notice that the world poverty is falling. This is the number of people in millions, and this is the time trend. So you notice that the world poverty is falling. This is the line for the world trend, and you notice that this from 1980 to 2010, this has shown a sharp steep fall. But an interesting point to note here is that if from this world you exclude China, we are not even excluding India, if we only exclude China from this world and we plot the same trend, then this trend becomes flat. This is the trend that we see here, which is flat, which means that if we exclude China from this idea of world, then the world status of poverty is almost stagnant, it is almost stable, which means that it is only because of these two populous economies like China and India, and in fact not even India plays a huge role. The Chinese economy plays a major role, because just by excluding China we see almost a horizontal curve here, which means that the number of people who are poor, who are living below $1 a day, is almost the same in 1980 as in 2010, excluding China. But if we include China, then definitely we see a sharp decrease. In sub-Saharan Africa, on the other hand, it is actually increasing. So again, stressing on the same idea that if we care for people, then this picture is a correct picture to take ahead, that yes, people are moving out of poverty, people are able to make that great escape, but not countries. Not all countries are able to make that great escape. Not all, except few like Chinese and the Indian economy, not all countries are able to, not all poor countries are able to make that great escape. Right. The next section talks about how do people see their own lives. So it is also important to understand that when we talk about inequalities, we talk about poverty, we talk about it from a point of view of a development economist. But if we go and talk to people, and if we ask them about how do they feel about their lives, do we get the same kinds of results? Do we get the same kinds of inequalities, same kinds of poverty, or does the picture change? So living a good life may need more than health and money. The escape from deprivation that development brings should also involve better education and a better ability to participate in civic affairs, which is very true, that to live a good life, you may not just need a good health and money. You may also want to be acknowledged for your opinions so you should be able to participate in civic affairs. You should be educated, you should have your own opinions. To be able to make your own opinions, you should have access to good education. So there has been great progress in recent decades on these aspects, but there is still much more to be done. More children are regularly attending school, more people are becoming literate, hundreds of millions of people live with restrictions on civic participation because of countries which follow more autocratic rule, and there are so many dictators around the world, which leads to restrictions on civic participation. But there is at the same time also political freedom, much more political freedom in the world now as was the case half a century ago. So life is definitely getting better for most of the world, at least in terms of the opportunities that these circumstances allow. But it is always possible that people do not see their lives in terms of these measures. Obviously, it is possible that people may not want to assess their life based on these parameters. Or people may value completely different things that we haven't included in our list so far. So since we have been talking about development, we have talked about a lot of things, but it's possible that we are missing out on certain important things that people will value for themselves if they had to assess whether they are living a good life or not. So it is always a good deal for asking people how they think their lives are going. One way to do this is to use self-reported measures of well-being. So one way is to ask people that how well do they think their life is, and they report it themselves. Economists, psychologists and philosophers these days have become interested in these measures, and they are getting into these types of data collection where people are being asked to self-report their well-being. These measures, which are also often referred to as measures of happiness, have directly come from people whose well-being we are trying to assess. But at the same time, there are many economists and many philosophers who have reservations for these self-reported measures of well-being because of the following reasons. So we do not always know what people are thinking when they answer these questions. We are not sure what's exactly going on in people's heads when we ask these questions to them that assess their life. So maybe it's possible that when you ask a certain person, at that moment he feels that his life is not that great. Maybe that is a momentary feeling, but that will get reflected in the survey while collecting the data, and he may report that he is not satisfied with his life, but maybe in reality he is extremely satisfied with his life. An opposite case could be that a person who's living who is not really very satisfied with his life, it's possible that right before the data collection process there's something that has happened, that is great, which is a great thing that has happened to the person, and he may report that yes, he is extremely satisfied with his life. So we may not always get accurate measures when we ask people about how well they feel their life is. A lot of times it is also possible that questions are interpreted in different ways by different people, so translation becomes a problem. So Americans use happy, the term happy, more freely and more frequently than the French would use the term, which is a translation of the English term happy. So again, if you are using a particular survey, then you need to make sure that it is the same words that are being used across countries, but the same words might lose their meaning in translation. So that again becomes a problem in self-reported measures. So there are certain technical issues with using self-reported measures when we try to assess how happy people are with their own lives. Beyond these measurement issues, there is another concern, which is the concern of adaptation. People living in desperate circumstances can come to believe that this is the best life they can offer, and they report they are happy because it's possible that they haven't really been explored to the possible improvements in their life. So people sometimes adapt to where they are in the situation. So they might feel that this is the best life that they are living, and it's possible that who are living in the lap of luxury, they have become so used to the wealth that they have gained that they tend to become dissatisfied over trivial over the absence of trivial luxuries. So a full and happy life can sometimes involve pain and loss. So this becomes more philosophical in the nature because we do not know why people are answering that they are happy. Is it because they have adapted to the kind of situations they are living in, or is it that they have become so used to living a particular life that because of trivial absence they can report that they are not satisfied? So self reported measures will have all these potential problems, and hence some economists are skeptical about using these parameters, using these variables as measures of well-being. Here in this paragraph you will notice that the life evaluation score for several countries are given, and on a scale of 0 to 10 these countries are given a certain number, 0 being the least and the 10 being the highest. And you notice that countries like Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden, US, they all have the score greater than 7, whereas if you look at the score of Sierra Leone, Zimbabwe, Burundi, then Benin, Afghanistan, these are all places which have the life evaluation score which is lesser than the other set of countries. So, although the philosophical questions on the idea of assessing growth through self-reported measures is true, we have just discussed some of the issues that could possibly occur when we use self-reported measures as measures of development. But if we look at the relationship between growth and these self-reported measures, that they seem to be in coherence with each other. So you will see that higher scores are given by people in countries which are well-off countries, even in the sense of other aspects of development that we have discussed so far. So whether it be health, income, these countries, the first few countries which have scores greater than 7 are the countries which are well off on all these parameters, and they are also given higher numbers by the people through self-reported measures. So the parameters that we usually use to assess development, they are in coherence with the self-reported measures of well-being given out by people. Another trend that we had looked at, other parameters of development, is the time trend, which is that with the passing time there has been improvement for almost every country. If we compare the countries from 1960s to today, then we will notice that almost every country has improved in terms of these parameters. It would be interesting to know whether the life evaluation or the self-reported measures of well-being, whether they have also improved for all the countries over a period of time. But unfortunately, the data that we have for all these countries, which is the Gallup's World Poll, that only began in 2006. So we don't really have data backdated to 90s, 1960s, or probably time before that, to be able to identify the relationship that these countries have seen on the life evaluation scores over a period of time. So, even so, the residents of richer countries systematically value their lives more highly than those of poor countries. This fact creates a strong presumption that growth is good for the way that people feel about their lives. So, we can say that growth is actually good for people to value their lives, because we do see that in richer countries like Denmark, Finland, people are giving higher scores as compared to countries such as Afghanistan. And so on. So definitely we can presume that growth is a good way for people, is good for the way that people feel about their lives. In 1974, economist and historian Richard Easterlin, he's a pioneer in measuring self-reported well-being. He actually pointed this fact out, which goes against the just established point, which is that people in richer countries feel that their lives are more valuable and they are better off as compared to people in poorer countries. He went against this idea and he said that although there has been economic growth in Japan, that had not resulted into betterment of people's lives by their own reports. So he said in his work that when he found out the measures of self-reported measures of well-being, he found that the growth in Japan, the massive growth that Japan witnessed, was not matching up with the improvements in the life evaluation score reported by these people. So, and he subsequently extended his work to find other such countries who have this kind of starking relationship where the life evaluation scores do not go in line with the income scores. But again, there were other economists who went on and went against his idea. Easterlin was an unusual economist, where he argued that growth is worthless in and of itself, and his sort of position, his sort of ideology resonates more with psychologists, religious leaders, and other who deny the materialistic basis of well-being. But his ideas were being opposed by other economists like Stevenson and Wolfers, who said that with properly comparable data, economic growth within countries improve life evaluation in exactly the same way that we would expect from differences in life evaluation between rich and poorer countries. So they said that with proper data, with comparable data, we can establish the fact that life evaluation scores improve just the same way within the countries as they do across countries. So the intra-country relationship that we just saw between life evaluation scores and income, in the same manner, in the same way, life evaluation scores should improve within the country as well. So within the country, if people move from poorer societies to richer societies, they will sort of place more values on their life as compared to when they were poorer. But we do have some exceptions here as well, just as in the case of health. We had looked at some examples such as Sri Lanka, if you remember in the last few chapters, where we said that despite having low income, the health indicators of life expectancy turned out to be as that of any other rich country. So we do have these exceptions in the life evaluation scores as well. So for example, Scandinavian countries, which are considered as very rich countries, their life evaluation scores turn out to be they're not as high as the world would predict based on their national incomes. Similarly, Latin American countries, which are not, they do not really possess a high level of income, but they do better in terms of life evaluation score. In fact, if you compare these Latin American countries with some of the better of East Asian countries such as China, Japan, Hong Kong, or Korea, you will notice that they their life evaluation scores are actually worse off as compared to these Latin American countries whose income level is lesser than these East Asian economies. So we again do have these exceptions, as we saw in the cases of other parameters of development. We do not know whether these continental differences, they come from genuine differences in some objective aspect of well-being, or is it the differences in the way people respond to the ladder question, or any, or the kinds of philosophical questions or doubts that we had over the measure of well-being. So we do not know whether these differences come because of genuine differences in the well-being, or because of other technical doubts that we had on the measure of self reported well-being. The last section here is on emotional well-being. uh, So the life evaluation measures that we were just discussing, they are often described as measures of happiness, even though, as in the ladder question, there may not be any mention of happiness. Now, this is a good evidence that that life evaluation measures which are being asked to people to assess how their lives are going, they pick up different aspects of experience, and it's possible that because of these different aspects of experience being picked up by people, different results from the questions about feelings or experienced emotions come out in the results. So, because the life evaluation questions would just ask people to rank their lives from 0 to 10, it's possible that people consider different aspects or different things when they are making this ranking. And there is no mention of happiness in the question. So, it is possible to be unhappy or worried even at times when you think your life is going well. These emotional experiences that you might have, so even when you think that your life is going well, and maybe you give a ranking of 8 to your life on the ladder scale, you still can feel unhappy or worried or stressed about your life. So to capture these important emotional experiences, because they become an important contributor to the current well-being of individuals. So, just as we ask people to evaluate their lives on a ladder of 0 to 10, we can also ask them about their emotional experiences. So, this famous data collection that has been happening, which is called as which is under the name of Gallup World Poll. In addition to these life evaluation questions, they also ask people about their emotions and feelings that they had experienced the day before the survey, asking about worry. Some of these emotions are mentioned here, about whether they were worried, stressed, whether they were sad or depressed or happy or angry or in pain. So, besides these questions on life, evaluating life from 0 to 10, the Gallup's World Poll also asks question on these different emotions. And the map of happiness is shown in the next figure, which basically plots the national income against the fraction of people who reported that they experienced happiness during a lot of the day yesterday. So let's have a look at this graph, which basically again tries to compare how these measures of emotional well-being, how do they relate to the income levels of countries. A kind of relationship that we see here in figure 7 between income and happiness in the world, where we, on the x-axis, we have GDP per capita, and on the y-axis we have fraction of people who said that they were happy for the lot of the day yesterday meaning the day before the day of the survey. And we see that we don't really see a very clear trend here, as we saw in the case of life evaluation scores, where where mostly the rich countries got a much higher score as compared to the poorer countries. But here you see that we don't really see such a clear trend. It's more like a concave looking graph, and then it initially increases, and then it becomes convex. So there's no clear strong relationship between the happiness measure and the income level. In fact, if you look at some specific examples here, such as Denmark, which was given a very high score in terms of life evaluation, you will find that this country here, Denmark, you would see that not many people are happy. Not many people reported that they were happy or they were experiencing happiness the day before the survey took place. So, if you look at these specific measures of emotional well being, then you do get different results as compared to life evaluation scores. Whereas if you look at countries like Bangladesh, Nepal, or Kenya, these are countries which do not possess a very high life evaluation score, but a lot of people reported that they were happy as compared to countries whose life evaluation scores, or in fact income for that matter, is also higher than these countries. So the limited relationship between income and experienced happiness, this holds true within the United States as well. Poverty generates misery, but beyond a certain point, additional money does nothing to improve happiness. So, it is a well stated fact that it's true that lack of income or poverty will generate misery in your life, but it's also true that after a certain point, which is uh, considered as $70,000 a year, which is also considered as the benchmark, if you remember, in the calculations of HDI. Beyond this point of income, additional money that you get, that actually doesn't add anything to the level of happiness for an individual. Even those with more money will report, even though people with more money might report that they have better lives. But if you look at the aspect of happiness, then that may not hold true. For the happiness indicators, money will matter only up to a certain point. I think this is a good point because the rest of the chapter basically just gives you a summary of what we have discussed in this chapter so far. So basically, we've looked at different aspects of well-being, and this chapter dwells more into philosophical ideas than just restricting itself to talking about parameters which can be easily measured. It also gets into measures which are not so easy to capture and which could have their own constraints, own technical constraints. But we do get an idea of how these measures, such as the life evaluation measure or the measure of happiness, how they are related to the more accurately measurable parameters such as income. How do these two relate with each other, and what are the kind of trends that we see in them? So this is, I think, a good point to stop for this chapter. I would expect you guys to read through the chapter, and if you have any questions from this part specifically, then we can conduct a class to take this up as a doubt session.